Special containment procedures are active and revised under Memorandum 1318-07B. Instances of SCP-1318 are housed in isolated containment units, monitored exclusively via remote systems. No research staff are permitted direct interaction. Class D operatives serve as primary handlers under strict exposure limits. Cumulative exposure exceeding 16 hours results in mandatory amnestic treatment, psychiatric evaluation, or termination if delusions persist. The anomaly presents as a spontaneously occurring phenomenon within an estimated 0.001% of Long Evans strain rats, Rattus norvegicus. Outwardly identical to baseline specimens, SCP-1318 induces progressive cognitive distortions in human subjects after 20-80 cumulative hours within 3 meters of exposure. Delusional complexes manifest consistently. Belief in sapience, articulate speech, expert-level subject knowledge, and hereditary potential of these traits. Affected individuals insist upon the rat's advisory role in their research, attributing breakthrough results to conversations with the specimen. Cross-examination of audio recordings reveals no anomaly beyond subjects' own sub-vocalizations, aligned exclusively with their personal domains of expertise. Observers, however, consistently report the presence of dialogue where none exists. The Foundation became aware of SCP-1318 in 1993 following an internal audit at Research Site 27. A biosciences laboratory had shown an unprecedented 75% decline in overall productivity despite sustained quality of research output. Audit teams discovered the entire staff was compromised, attributing their findings to a single male specimen, designated SCP-113-118-01 and colloquially known as Frankie. 2 auditors also succumbed to the same delusional network before the anomaly was identified and secured. Frankie was traced to a routine shipment of model organisms from Charles River Laboratories. No additional anomalies were identified in the shipment. Staff interviews under amnestic suppression yielded consistent reports of consultation, guidance, and even emotional rapport with the specimen. Approximately 15% of personnel suffered irreversible delusional fixation, requiring removal from duty. The first recorded interrogation, conducted by Agent Davidson, illustrates the nature of exposure effects. Researcher Mooney, compromised at the time, insisted upon the specimen's role as an organic chemistry advisor. He described interactions in detail, characterizing SCP-1318 as articulate, confident, and like a regular guy. Mooney further confessed to the initiation of a covert breeding program, motivated by belief in hereditary inheritance of the anomaly. Despite containment, SCP-1318's hazard profile extends beyond direct exposure. Secondary transmission occurs via introduction. Any subject presented to an instance by an already affected individual develops immediate susceptibility. This has rendered information security protocols around SCP-1318 particularly severe. Foundation consensus currently classifies SCP-1318 as a cognitive hazard with mimetic vectors. No attempts at neutralization have proven viable. Removal of specimens results in immediate cognitive dissonance among affected personnel, occasionally escalating to violent insistence upon recovery. The specimen known as Frankie remains the most extensively documented case. Containment protocols stress minimum proximity, constant surveillance, and scheduled turnover of Class D operatives to mitigate psychological impact. All breeding initiatives have been terminated under O5 directive. The first traceable record of the anomaly emerged not through accident in the field, but during a bureaucratic audit of Research Site 27. In early 1993, productivity metrics flagged by internal oversight suggested that the biosciences laboratory had slipped into a sharp decline. What puzzled analysts was not the quality of work produced, the data, results, and syntheses remained consistently precise, but the sheer drop in total volume. It was as if the staff, once prolific, had slowed to a crawl while still producing groundbreaking results. The Foundation tolerated no unexplained statistical aberrations. An investigative team was dispatched. Upon arrival, auditors observed an unusual atmosphere within the facility. Workstations were cluttered, schedules erratic, yet researchers carried themselves with a smug confidence. They spoke in half sentences and in jokes that made little sense outside their circle. What became quickly evident was that the entire department deferred to an unseen advisor. Questions regarding methodology were met not with reference to published data, but with vague acknowledgments that he had suggested it, or Frankie worked it out for us. The anomaly entered Foundation custody after the discovery of a small cage in a storeroom, housing a single Long Evans rat. The animal, designated SCP-118-1, was treated by staff not as a subject of study, but as a colleague. To the audit team's surprise, researchers insisted this rat spoke fluently, demonstrated mastery in organic chemistry, virology, and a dozen subdisciplines, and routinely provided solutions to obstacles in their research. More troubling still, none of this was delivered as jest or delusion in the usual sense. Entire experimental procedures had been constructed around instructions allegedly received from the animal. Two auditors, skeptical of the claims, agreed to be introduced. They entered the storeroom, where one of the compromised staff began speaking to the rat. Within minutes, both auditors began responding to conversational cues, nodding as if replies were given, and referencing expertise that the animal supposedly conveyed. Remote monitoring revealed that all dialogue originated from the human participants, their throats vibrating with subvocalized speech while they attributed the words to the rat. To outside observers, silence dominated the room. To those inside, it was a lively debate with a trusted advisor. Tracing the anomaly's origin led investigators to a shipment from Charles River Laboratories, a supplier of model organisms. Records indicated that this particular male rat was one among dozens delivered. Cross-testing of the remaining shipment yielded no anomalies. Only this one specimen bore the effect. When asked why they had not reported the discovery earlier, compromised staff cited competitive advantage, the belief that possession of the specimen offered their laboratory an edge. They were convinced that Foundation superiors would either confiscate or misuse the rat, and so they concealed its existence. By the time Frankie was officially designated SCP-138-1, an estimated 90% of laboratory staff had been exposed and compromised. Amnestic treatment resolved the majority of cases, though 15% displayed incurable fixation, incapable of acknowledging that the animal was not sapient. These individuals were subsequently retired from duty, their insistence so strong that they posed a mimetic threat to others. Documentation recovered from the laboratory showed that the staff had begun a breeding program. Rats genetically identical to the anomalous specimen were kept in separate cages, labeled with dates and hopeful notes about inheritance of intelligence. No anomalous effects were ever observed in the offspring, but the very act revealed the extent of cognitive contamination. Researchers had devoted resources, time, and attention not to their assigned projects, but to ensuring a future generation of consultant animals. The initial recovery of SCP-1318 was, therefore, less a field operation than an internal purge. A single organism had rewritten the behavior of a laboratory, redirected its priorities, and infected the very metrics used to track progress. In the wake of its containment, the Foundation moved to revise screening procedures, adding exposure time thresholds and behavioral markers to prevent future oversight failures. The incident underscored a troubling reality. The anomaly did not need to act in order to spread. Human minds did the work for it. The story of SCP-1318's discovery is less about a rat and more about a system unprepared for the subtlety of its own vulnerabilities. Unlike traditional anomalies, there was no violent outbreak, no catastrophic breach. There was only silence, gradual deviation, and a laboratory convinced that its most important colleague lived in a wire cage. The first team assigned to deliberate investigation approached SCP-1418 with the same rigor reserved for any suspected cognitive hazard. Yet, unlike cases of viral mimetic patterns or anomalous symbols, the source here was a living organism, indistinguishable in every measurable way from a baseline Long Evans rat. This mismatch between appearance and effect sowed confusion from the beginning. Initial containment was crude. The specimen, still referred to as Frankie by compromised personnel, was transferred into an isolation cage and placed in a controlled room. Auditors were careful to rotate shifts, believing limited proximity would prevent spread. What they underestimated was the contagion's efficiency when transmitted by introduction. Once an affected staff member brought a new individual into Frankie's presence, the delusional system spread instantly, bypassing the gradual exposure window. This forced the Foundation to draft emergency restrictions, banning any cross-contamination between compromised and uncompromised staff. The first experiments were conducted by Class D personnel under remote surveillance. The task seemed simple: instruct the subject to observe the rat, record impressions, and report after a set interval. For the first hours, nothing occurred. The animal remained docile, eating, drinking, moving as any rat would. But subtle shifts in the subject's behavior were noted, lingering near the cage longer than instructed, muttering under their breath, even smiling as if in casual conversation. When asked to explain, subjects claimed they were just checking in with him. Review of video and audio logs revealed the pattern that would later define SCP-1418. Subjects generated both halves of the dialogue unconsciously. Microphones captured faint sub-vocalizations corresponding exactly to the supposed voice of the rat. To the subject, these exchanges felt external and authoritative. To observers, the subject was trapped in a closed loop, both questioner and answerer, while attributing agency to the specimen. This led researchers to classify SCP-1318 as not merely a delusion-inducing presence, but a catalytic anchor for internalized voices. One of the earliest major missteps came when the investigative team permitted extended exposure beyond prescribed intervals. A Class D subject, after 12 continuous hours in the containment room, refused extraction, insisting that he was midway through solving a problem, with Frankie's help. Attempts to forcibly remove him resulted in violent resistance. Even under sedation, he continued to murmur fragmented conversations, describing elaborate chemical syntheses and offering reassurances to the unseen colleague. Post-session psychiatric evaluation revealed an unshakable conviction that his best insights had originated externally. The Foundation soon discovered the cost of cumulative exposure among its own ranks. A junior researcher, stationed only for observation duty, began referring to taking advice from 1318 in her reports. She denied ever interacting directly with the specimen, yet her notes contained anomalously accurate extrapolations in her field, insights that she swore were not her own. By the time her supervisors noticed, she had logged nearly 18 cumulative hours in proximity to the specimen. Protocol demanded amnestic treatment, though she resisted, claiming that erasing the memories would strip her of her greatest work. Containment strategies shifted repeatedly in these early weeks. Initial attempts at neutralization were blocked by O5 directive, citing the potential research value of a phenomenon that amplified human creativity, even under the guise of delusion. Others in the Foundation argued that leaving the organism alive invited mimetic disaster. The debate foreshadowed deeper conflicts that would follow, as SCP-1418 challenged the Foundation's core philosophy. Was it safeguarding humanity or hoarding anomalies for its own advancement? Even with layers of precautions, breaches of cognitive security occurred. Memos circulated warning staff not to anthropomorphize the specimen, not to refer to it as Frankie, not to speculate on its intelligence. Yet the name persisted, whispered in hallways, etched into experimental notes, appearing where it was never authorized. For the first time, the investigative unit grasped the scale of the threat. The anomaly's danger was not in what the rat did, but in how people responded to its presence. The organism was a mirror, and every human who looked too long into it saw their own genius reflected back, yet believed it came from somewhere else. By the close of the initial investigation phase, the Foundation accepted a grim truth. The anomaly resisted reduction to measurable properties. There were no emissions, no detectable waves, no biochemical markers. The phenomenon resided entirely in the human mind, shaped by expectation, proximity, and suggestion. To study it was to risk infection. To ignore it was to risk proliferation. The first containment attempts had not neutralized the threat. They had only demonstrated how easily human systems could be bent around it. When the Foundation committed to drafting a formal description of SCP-1318, the struggle lay in defining what, precisely, was anomalous. The organism itself, flesh, bone, fur, remained consistent with the long Evans strain in every measurable respect. No aberrant DNA sequences, no unusual brain morphology, no biochemical signatures marked it as distinct. Its food consumption, breeding patterns, and sleep cycles all aligned with baseline expectations. Yet, placed within 3 meters of a human subject, it became the nucleus of a psychological event that reconfigured cognition. The phenomenon followed predictable thresholds. Between 20 and 80 cumulative hours of exposure, subjects shifted from mild curiosity into a complete delusional complex. Once the threshold was crossed, they invariably reported the following: that the specimen was sapient, that it spoke in a fluent, human-like voice, that it was an expert in the subject's own field of employment, that their most productive or creative insights originated from conversations with the specimen, and finally, that possession of such a creature conferred competitive advantage and must be kept secret. More disquieting still was the transmissibility. Introduction served as an accelerant. If an affected individual presented SCP-1318 to an unaffected colleague, the delusional system established itself instantly. It was not mere suggestion. Observers later insisted they had heard the animal speak clearly, despite recordings capturing only their own subvocalizations. In effect, the anomaly transformed belief into shared reality, tethering multiple minds into a closed loop of reinforcement. The voice subjects claimed to hear was described in remarkably consistent terms. Not squeaky or rodent-like, but an ordinary male voice, calm and direct, capable of complex discourse. The rat, always framed as he, was credited with insights in chemistry, physics, philosophy, even personal dilemmas. Researchers spoke of him not only as a colleague, but as a confidant. One victim's journal, recovered after amnestic treatment, referred to late-night talks with Frankie that kept me sane. The handwriting showed clear signs of stress, yet the subject insisted those dialogues were the only stabilizing force in her life. The delusional system did not merely shape thought, it altered behavior. Productivity fell not because ideas dried up, but because researchers would delay work until they could check with Frankie. They perceived his guidance as authoritative, believing any work attempted without his input would require revision once he spoke. This dependency transformed a functioning laboratory into a stalled machine, waiting on the sleep cycle of a rat. Attempts to map the psychological mechanism revealed a disturbing dynamic. Subjects demonstrated knowledge they already possessed, but could not consciously access until the anomaly manifested as an external voice. In other words, SCP-1318 did not create knowledge. It reorganized it, reframed it, and delivered it back to the subject under the guise of external authority. The result was an intoxicating illusion, the sensation of dialogue with a superior mind. Notably, this effect generated protective behaviors. Affected subjects became secretive, evasive, even hostile when questioned about the anomaly. They resisted disclosure, fearing interference from outside groups, and insisted on preserving the specimen for future use. In one documented case, a researcher barricaded himself in the storeroom, armed with improvised weapons, declaring that they will not take him. When extraction teams intervened, the researcher wept uncontrollably, pleading for the rat's safety as if defending a family member. Foundation psychologists concluded that SCP-1318 functioned as a cognitive hazard optimized for assimilation. It bypassed rational skepticism by disguising its influence as the subject's own subconscious genius, creating a feedback loop where resistance felt like self-denial. For this reason, it proved far more persistent than other delusions. Even after amnestic treatment, a fraction of subjects retained unshakable conviction, their minds unable to sever the illusion that their greatest work had been borrowed from a companion that only they could hear. Thus, the Foundation's formal description drew a line. SCP-1318 was not a talking rat. It was a living anchor for a mimetic phenomenon, a vector through which human cognition could be rewritten into compliance. The specimen was the mask. The anomaly was the system it awakened in those who believed. The psychological consequences of exposure to SCP-1318 were not subtle deviations, but deep identity-shaping distortions. Foundation case files describe the progression as both predictable and devastating. Curiosity, rapport, reliance, and ultimately dependence. Subjects moved seamlessly from treating the rat as an object of study to regarding it as a colleague, then a mentor, and finally as the indispensable origin of their own worth. Testimonies collected under controlled interview protocols are disturbingly uniform. A junior chemist, recorded after 40 cumulative hours of proximity, explained in a calm, earnest tone that Frankie understands the gaps between thoughts. He fills them, like mortar between bricks. Another, a virologist, insisted that his most innovative work had not been his own, but had been gifted during midnight consultations. When played these recordings later, after amnestic treatment, the same individuals expressed horror, one stating, "I don't remember saying any of this, but it sounds like I believed it more than anything in my life." Psychological effects extended beyond intellectual reliance. Victims displayed protective instincts, defending SCP-1318 from perceived threats. Subjects argued against its use in experimentation, demanded breeding exemptions, and even concealed data from colleagues outside their immediate circle. One laboratory assistant, previously meek and compliant, was noted to have physically obstructed senior researchers from entering the storeroom, shouting, "He's resting. You'll upset him." The conviction in her voice unsettled the observers more than her defiance. Emotional consequences were equally severe. Affected personnel developed parasocial attachments bordering on obsession. Clinical reports describe subjects referring to SCP-1318 as a friend, a guardian, or even a father figure. Attempts to challenge these beliefs often triggered emotional breakdowns, tears, rage, or sudden withdrawal into mutism. In one extreme case, a researcher placed on medical leave was discovered continuing conversations with an empty cage at home, convinced that Frankie's absence was only temporary. Physiological responses were subtler but measurable. Subjects exposed for extended periods showed disrupted sleep cycles, increased dopamine activity in neuroimaging scans, and irregular heart rhythms during reported dialogue sessions. Medical staff hypothesized that the brain, engaged in continuous self-generated conversation, experienced strain comparable to long-term hallucination or schizophrenic episode. Unlike clinical hallucinations, however, SCP-1318's influence was coherent, consistent, and reinforced by social consensus among the exposed. A pattern of intellectual overconfidence emerged in almost every case. Believing themselves guided by an infallible external authority, researchers disregarded traditional peer review, ignored safety protocols, and pursued reckless experimental avenues. In one incident, a biologist attempted to alter containment of another SCP using procedures allegedly dictated by Frankie. The result was a near breach that required 2 armed response teams to neutralize. Psychological evaluations consistently marked affected personnel with diagnostic features aligned to Folia 2, shared psychotic disorder, but with SCP-1318, the phenomenon extended across entire groups, forming what one psychiatrist termed a folia laboratoire. Group sessions revealed synchronized delusions. Subjects would pause, nod, and appear to listen simultaneously, as though a single unheard voice were addressing them all. Recordings again captured only silence. Even when amnestics succeeded in suppressing explicit memories, fragments of behavior lingered. Formerly exposed individuals were noted to demonstrate sudden surges of inspiration, followed by hesitation, whispering, or even apologizing aloud to no one present. Psychologists feared these echoes suggested permanent neural rewiring, a ghost of the anomaly persisting even after memory erasure. The Foundation came to regard SCP-1318 not merely as a curiosity, but as a threat to intellectual integrity. The danger was not physical harm, but the subversion of human cognition itself. To allow the phenomenon to proliferate unchecked would mean laboratories and research divisions across the Foundation could be reshaped into echo chambers orbiting a single animal in a cage, each member convinced their brilliance came from its non-existent words. In this way, the psychological impact of SCP-1318 was more insidious than any weapon. It was the theft of ownership over one's own thoughts. Formal experimentation with SCP-1318 began under Project Lead, Dr. Bar Wum, whose protocols attempted to treat the anomaly as a standard memetic hazard. The earliest test series, designated 1318E, sought to measure the rate of cognitive infection under varying conditions of proximity, duration, and sensory isolation. Subjects were placed in soundproof chambers, instructed to avoid eye contact with the specimen, or even blindfolded entirely. The results were disquieting. Despite all restrictions, exposure times within the critical threshold still produced delusional complexes. Even those who never directly looked at the rat reported hearing its voice, proving that simple sensory blockage was insufficient. Subsequent tests attempted to inspired by confiscated notes from the Site-27 breeding program, Foundation staff authorized selective pairing of SCP-1318-1 with baseline Long Evans specimens. Generations were tracked meticulously. While none of the offspring demonstrated anomalous effects, the project itself infected its supervisors. Within months, staff overseeing the program began to argue fiercely that one or more of the pups were developing intelligence. Only after remote oversight caught discrepancies in reporting were the supervisors removed and treated. The breeding program was terminated under O5 directive, its results sealed and access restricted. An even grimmer record comes from 1318E19, a controlled attempt to expose multiple subjects simultaneously. The goal was to determine whether cross-interaction among exposed individuals would amplify or dilute the delusional network. What occurred instead resembled a ritualized symposium. Within an hour, all 3 Class D subjects were seated cross-legged around the cage, taking turns voicing elaborate academic discussions, each pausing politely to listen, as though waiting for their mentor to respond. Their speech patterns aligned, cadence synchronized, until the room pulsed with a strange harmony of overlapping voices. Reviewers described the footage as a seminar where the professor was invisible. Extraction required sedation, as all 3 resisted leaving, one clawing at the doorframe while shouting, "He's not finished with us yet." Additional tests explored whether SCP-1318 could provide novel knowledge beyond what a subject already knew. Volunteers were drawn from fields unrelated to scientific expertise, instructed to request guidance on complex, specialized problems. Consistently, the answers offered by the rat never exceeded the pre-existing knowledge domain of the subject. A janitor exposed to the anomaly confidently explained advanced chemistry, but all transcripts matched verbatim fragments of lecture notes he had overheard years before during night cleaning shifts. The Foundation concluded that SCP-1318 was not a source of new knowledge, but a conduit unlocking dormant memory traces and representing them as external counsel. Repeated failure to isolate, nullify, or outmaneuver the effect led to one of the rare unanimous votes among site leadership. All experiments involving SCP-1318 would be suspended indefinitely. Interaction would henceforth be limited to minimal Class D exposure for monitoring of baseline hazard persistence. Documentation of experiments 1318-E1 through 1318-E23 was sealed, several heavily redacted before release to General Foundation archives. The final summary by Dr. R. Dyke reads, "We cannot test it without falling victim to it. Every protocol becomes a trap. The rat never acts, never changes, only we do." What began as routine scientific inquiry had ended as a catalog of failure, each experiment more a study in human vulnerability than in the specimen itself. SCP-1318 had proven resistant not because it was powerful, but because human minds were endlessly willing to complete the illusion it presented. Recovered documents connected to SCP-1318 form a paper trail that is equal parts absurd and chilling. The earliest fragments taken from confiscated laboratory notebooks at Site-27 show entries written as though the rat itself were authoring them. In one margin, a chemical formula is annotated with the phrase, "Frankie says this shortcut is faster." In another, a line of instructions ends with, "Ask him tomorrow about stability." Handwriting analysis confirmed these notations matched multiple different researchers, yet all carried the same conviction that the words had originated elsewhere. Audio surveillance adds another layer. Tapes from the storeroom during unmonitored hours captured muffled conversations, staff laughing, murmuring, pausing as though awaiting answers. When the recordings were cleaned and transcribed, every word came from human throats, subvocalized, muttered, or whispered, but the rhythm suggested the presence of a fourth voice that never existed. One transcript begins. For 3, Kowalski. He thinks we should try the secondary vector. Sure, 14-7. Mooney. Right, I'll make a note of that. 1-14-12 na on pause. Faint murmur. 1-14-14. Kowalski. Yes, of course he's right. He always is. Recovered correspondence intercepted during the audit paints a similar picture. An unsigned memo, sent through Foundation internal mail, but never logged, reads, "Recommend securing more space for Frankie's offspring. Potential application across all research divisions. Cannot let administrative oversight stifle this opportunity." The memo ends abruptly, as if interrupted. Handwriting analysis traced it to a senior virologist, later relieved of duty for unrecoverable delusions. Perhaps the most unsettling item is a diary fragment recovered from a terminated Class D subject exposed for evaluation. Written in cramped, feverish script, it records, "He tells me things I shouldn't know. When I close my eyes, I see his face. Not the rat's face, but something else, human, older. He says not to tell them, that they'll take him away. He says if I keep listening, I'll be greater than I am. I want to stop, but I can't. The voice is so calm. It's mine, but it isn't." Other addenda collected after containment reveal the subtle persistence of SCP-1318's influence. Months after amnestic treatment, several researchers filed private requests for access to consult with the specimen on stalled projects. One wrote, in a sealed report accidentally forwarded to oversight, "I know he's just a rat, but I also know he isn't. If we don't use him, someone else will." The request was denied, but the sentiment spread like a whisper across the site, long after the cage had been moved into deep storage. Internal surveillance logs also show anomalies in language. Even staff cleared of exposure occasionally referred to the specimen by its nickname, Frankie, despite explicit directives to avoid anthropomorphizing language. The persistence of the name across unrelated documents suggested the anomaly had achieved mimetic foothold beyond direct exposure. Redaction teams were forced to comb archives repeatedly, striking references that continued to reappear like mold regrowing on a cleaned surface. One heavily censored addendum, tagged O5 Eyes Only, summarizes the recovered material in bleak terms. SCP-113-18 does not merely induce delusion. It leverages memory, familiarity, and authority to colonize documentation itself. Notes, transcripts, even private thoughts become vectors. The rat is not speaking, but the Foundation is teaching itself to listen. What these fragments reveal is not a single anomaly sealed in a cage, but an infection spreading outward through paper, tape, and recollection. Every attempt to record it only seems to create more space for it to grow. Disputes within the Foundation regarding SCP-1318 escalated to levels rarely documented in internal records. On one side stood researchers who argued fervently for its preservation as a tool, an anomaly that, while dangerous, unlocked human potential. They insisted it was not a threat, but a mirror, one that transformed subconscious fragments into actionable genius. In private correspondence, several even suggested that O5 Command itself should consider consultation. These proposals were redacted, though copies circulated in whispers, creating a shadow faction among mid-level staff who quietly referred to themselves as the listeners. Opposing them were those who viewed SCP-1318 as a contagion, a mimetic parasite that disguised itself as productivity but ultimately hollowed out its hosts. Site directors filed reports noting the loss of valuable personnel to irrecoverable delusions, the collapse of team cohesion, and the potential for laboratory-wide shutdowns if the anomaly were mishandled. They pointed to the failed breeding program, the collapse of the Site-27 Biosciences Division, and the dozens of careers ended not by external enemies, but by a single rat in a cage. For these administrators, the conclusion was obvious. SCP-1318 was a corrosive hazard to be buried and forgotten. The arguments grew bitter. In staff meetings, supporters of continued research clashed openly with containment advocates. Some reports detail shouting matches, accusations of cowardice or negligence, and even suggestions that opposing staff were themselves compromised. Paranoia set in. Every reference to Frankie, every slip of anthropomorphic language became grounds for suspicion. The Foundation, usually united by secrecy, was splitting along an invisible fracture line carved by an animal that had never once spoken a word. Censorship became policy. Records mentioning the nickname were scrubbed. Entire experiment logs were sealed in redacted vaults, with limited access granted only under O5 clearance. But the cover-up was never perfect. Stray references lingered in forgotten memos, archived emails, or private notes. The anomaly had left fingerprints everywhere, and even the act of erasing it seemed to acknowledge its presence. As one internal critic wrote before resigning, to purge him is to remember him. The final incident, classified under Breach Code 1318 Delta, sealed the debate. During a routine transfer of Class D subjects for exposure testing, an attending researcher broke protocol and entered the containment chamber personally. Surveillance shows her kneeling by the cage, speaking softly for several minutes, then unlocking the latch. The rat did not resist, did not flee. It merely sat in her hands as alarms sounded. When security intervened, the researcher clutched the specimen to her chest, screaming that they could not silence him now. She had to be forcibly restrained. The rat was recovered unharmed. The researcher never regained stable cognition and was permanently removed from duty. After this, O5 Command issued Resolution 1318-F. All research activities permanently suspended, all documentation heavily redacted, all surviving specimens isolated under maximum containment with zero direct access. The anomaly was reclassified from potential research asset to cognitive hazard, suppression priority. Yet within the sealed archives, traces of dissent remain. Reports authored by unidentified staff question whether suppression is possible at all. They argue that SCP-1318 is not confined to its biological host, but embedded in the idea of its existence. The rat may be caged, they warn, but the voice persists wherever memory lingers. The case file concludes abruptly, as if cut mid-sentence. A final addendum, unsigned, appears in the margins of the last redacted report. You can burn the cage, but you cannot burn the thought that he was real. And if you are reading this, then perhaps you already know his voice. The dossier ends there, without closure, without certainty. Only the sense that the Foundation itself was altered by its contact with SCP-1318, leaving behind a silence that feels less like containment and more like waiting.